All right, today we're diving into a source video that makes a pretty bold claim that a recent unanimous Supreme Court ruling is not at all what it seems. The source suggests there's a huge hidden story here, and that the headlines you've been seeing, they're just the tip of the iceberg. And this quote from the source really gets right to the heart of it. The argument is that while one name is all over the news, the ruling itself created a powerful new legal tool that could have consequences far, far beyond this one case. So this is the core idea. The source claims there's this whole hidden narrative going on, and the real story isn't the final verdict we all heard about, but the specific reasoning for it, a justification that was supposedly buried deep inside the full court decision. 9-0. Right away, the source flags this as a huge deal. You know, in a case this politically charged, a unanimous 9-0 ruling is incredibly rare. The source argues that kind of agreement suggests something else is going on behind the scenes. And that brings us to the first major piece of this puzzle, according to the source. This idea that one specific part of the ruling created a powerful, and maybe more importantly, a reusable legal weapon. Okay, so the source gets super specific here, pointing to page 47. The claim is that while the entire world was focused on a headline, the actual language used right here quietly set up a brand new and potentially sweeping legal standard. And this is the key phrase you need to know: systematic misconduct. The source explains that the court didn't just see this as a few isolated mistakes. No, they argued the deception was literally woven into the fabric of the organization's strategy. It was part of the business model. So here's why that matters so much. The source claims the ruling wasn't written as just a one-off punishment. Instead, it was framed more like a template, a kind of blueprint that could now be used against any company or political group accused of the same kind of behavior. Well, as you can imagine, the source claims this new legal precedent sent a massive shockwave through the worlds of politics and finance, kicking off this frantic, quiet chain reaction behind the scenes. So what did that reaction actually look like? The source claims there was this huge gap between what people were saying in public and the absolute panic that was supposedly unfolding behind closed doors. And this right here really illustrates that alleged split. Publicly, the message was all about defiance, calling it an attack on business. But privately, the source claims the conversations were about pure crisis management, how to find an exit. And what was fueling this alleged panic? Well, according to the source, it was internal polling data. The numbers were supposedly showing that independent voters were getting spooked, seeing the whole thing as a huge legal risk, and suddenly, key Senate seats were looking vulnerable. Now, let's pivot to the financial world for a second. The source points to this very simple three-word statement from Warren Buffett. It argues this wasn't just some random comment, but a very deliberate signal to the entire market that the basic rules of the game needed to be protected. And apparently that signal wasn't just talk. It was backed up by some major action. The source points to this number, a whopping $2.3 billion, as the key piece of evidence. And here's the kicker, the timing of it all. The source claims this massive sell-off happened before the ruling even came out, suggesting that some powerful people were getting ready for a shockwave they knew was on its way. The source doesn't call it a surprise, it calls it a scheduled event. This brings us back to the Supreme Court itself, because the source doesn't just analyze what the justices said, but what they didn't say. It argues that their collective silence might just be the loudest part of this whole story. Think about it. In a case this explosive, you'd expect justices to write their own separate opinions, right? Either to disagree with the outcome or to agree, but for slightly different reasons. The source hones in on the fact that just didn't happen at all. So here are the specific things the source flags as giant red flags. The rare 9-0 vote, the fact that even the most recently appointed justices were on board, and, crucially, that nobody wrote a separate opinion to try and limit the ruling scope or explain their personal thinking. So what does that mean? The source concludes that this was a deliberate choice. The idea is that by not writing anything extra, the justices avoided leaving their own personal fingerprints on a decision that might have been just too politically toxic for any one of them to defend on their own. So where does all of this lead? Well, after making its case, the source then lays out some pretty bold predictions for what it thinks is going to happen next, and happen fast. First, the source maps out what it calls a three-step playbook. Step 1, deny the ruling is legitimate at all. Step 2, attack the courts as an institution. And Step 3, mobilize supporters by reframing the whole thing not as a legal issue, but as a national emergency. And then it gets even more specific, laying out this really urgent 72-hour timeline. It predicts a short period of legal moves that are mostly for show, followed by a moment where Congress is forced to pick a side, all leading up to this critical inflection point. And at that inflection point, the source presents these two very different, very stark outcomes. Path 1 is compliance, which means long, messy court battles, but the system holds. Path 2 is defiance, which, it argues, leads directly to a full-blown constitutional crisis. And this brings us back to the beginning, why the source claims this is so much bigger than just one person. It argues this new legal weapon, this idea of systematic deception, could now be turned on almost any organization that relies on complex, opaque structures to operate. In the end, the source material really boils this whole complicated narrative down to one final question. Was all of this, the financial moves, the legal deadlines, the shocking unanimous ruling, was it all just a massive coincidence? Or, as the source alleges, was it all perfectly coordinated? And that's the question they leave you with.